Lynn. They got a special program planned for you. And at this time, I want to welcome to the front Mr. Phil Kuhn. He'll be reading our scripture today from Hebrews 11 through 12. Other way, honey. If you want to follow along in your Pew Bible, you'll find it on page 1192.
By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and countless as the sand on the seashore.
Thank you. May God bless the reading and hearing of this word this morning. Many of us know our general history of our nation, but when it comes to the specifics, there might be a few history buffs out there. But I came across an interesting account that I wanted to share with you this morning. It goes back to December of 1776. And General George Washington and his men had suffered a series of military defeat after military defeat and loss. So they retreated across New Jersey, eventually crossed the Delaware River, and arrived in Pennsylvania on December 7th and 8th. By this time, much of the enthusiasm and the excitement, the initial excitement from the signing of the Declaration of Independence over the summer, it had been fading by now as they headed into winter. Fearing that the British would capture Philadelphia, the Continental Congress even fled and went to Baltimore. That's how dire things were. Whole companies of soldiers had already left Washington's army because their enlistments had expired. And there were many more coming up at the end of December. So things were looking rather rough, especially when you consider that some of the soldiers had died, been taken as prisoners of war, had suffered disease of some sort, or were injured. So as they gathered at this time during these winter months, they were in desperate need of some type of morale boost. There were desperate times, and for our fragile nation struggling to form, how Washington and his men would respond would be crucial to where we would go. There were desperate times. And recognizing this on December 18th, Washington wrote a letter to his brother. And it's interesting what he said. He said, if every nerve is not strained to recruit the new army with all possible expedition, I think the game is pretty nearly up. That's not the George Washington we tend to read in history, is it? Where he crosses the Delaware River and that famous painting there. Fortunately for him, the British Major General William Howe delayed pursuing Washington's forces and instead opted to set up various outposts. Because he wasn't fearing Washington trying to cross the Delaware River, because who would do that in the winter months? The outposts were set up, but they were kind of poorly coordinated. Howe figured that he could wait until the end of December for even more of Washington's soldiers to quit once their enlistments were up. And he was waiting for the forces to be even depleted even more. But this turned out to be a miscalculation that gave Washington and his men a chance to regroup. First thing Washington kind of did was he waited for 2 weeks. Given that a lot of the men were going to be heading out at the end of the month, that's pretty crucial. But he waited 2 weeks, and the wait proved to be invaluable as previously scattered troops and soldiers arrived to reinforce and rejuvenate his army. With that, Washington came up with a bold plan. The plan was for Washington's forces, he was going to have 3 of them, to cross the Delaware River at Christmas night, walk and carry their munitions in his force, his main force, 10 miles down to Trenton, New Jersey, where they would attack the Hessian group there stationed at that outpost. Now, who were the Hessians? Hessians were Germans who were hired out by the English to fight on their behalf. So it wasn't just all British over there. And they were intending to attack the Hessians early in the morning and catch them off guard. Another force of Washington's men would cross the river and attack the Hessian forces to the south in Bordentown, New Jersey, so they couldn't come up and help the folks in Trenton. Third force would block Assunpink Creek, the bridge there, and so they couldn't get across there. This well-timed three-pronged attack was meant to isolate the Hessian forces in Trenton and leave them vulnerable. The element of surprise was obviously critical, but there was one big problem that came up. The weather did not cooperate with Washington's plan at all. The river was nearly 300 yards wide, but Washington's boats faced blinding snow, raging winds, and ice-cold waters that slowed them down significantly. One of the folks that was there described it as hurricane-like winds. And remember, they're not just crossing over in their boats as men. They got munitions. They got horses to cross this river. This was a major ordeal. The boats were more likely just those flat boats, not like the one you see in the picture, in order to get them across. Several of the men who could not swim fell off, but fortunately they were able to get them back. But because of the weather, it slowed them down so much. Their deadline was to get across the river by midnight, but the last soldier didn't finish crossing until 3 a.m. 3 hours behind. And remember, they still had a 10-mile hike through the snow, sleet, and winter weather, during which they needed to try and keep their gunpowder dry somehow and remain silent as possible so as not to alert the enemy. Well, to make things worse, the other two forces that were supposed to assist Washington's force and corner them, get the group cornered in, they weren't able to make it across. So rather than having 5,000 soldiers in a three-pronged attack, Washington had one force, one-pronged attack with only 2,400 men. He faced the decisions: do we go in or do we not? Now keep in mind, they're already way behind schedule. They were hoping to attack early in the morning. Well, meanwhile, the Hessian forces in Trenton, commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, were exhausted from keeping the local militia at bay 3 nights in a row from December 22nd through the 25th. So all of them were exhausted. So when the winter storm came on Christmas Day, the Hessian officers were like, it's time to give the garrison a break. We all need to take a break. Nobody's going to be crazy enough to attack in this kind of weather. So they all took time to relax and rest. According to at least some reports, a loyalist spy by the name of Moses Dean had observed Washington amassing what he called, quote, a boatload of soldiers on Christmas Eve, and tried to warn Colonel Rall, but he was turned away. Because as the report goes, the colonel was immersed in a game of poker or chess, depending upon which account you read. It is reported that Dean wrote on a note to be given to the colonel, since he wasn't permitted to go in and see him, that read this: Washington is coming on you down the river. He will be here afore long. What they say is the note was given to Colonel Rall. He didn't even look at it. He just simply put it in his pocket. A little after 8 a.m. on December 26, Washington was amazed, with light fully up, amazed to still have the element of surprise. And he led his Continental Army, reduced as it was, bound to be tired as they were and worn out. He led them, and they had a victory that day. As you think about the little subtle things that happen, that change history, some of them are just little things that you wouldn't think matter, like a poker or a chess game. But I got to thinking, imagine what would have happened if the Hessians had been alert and prepared for a surprise attack that day. Imagine what would have happened if Washington's army had not persevered and attacked despite the harsh weather, despite the 4-hour delay, and despite not being the other two forces not being able to cross the river. Imagine what would have happened if Washington had not waited to receive reinforcements. If Washington and his men had given up instead of waiting and persevering in the face of overwhelming obstacles and odds, the revolution may not have lasted very long after that. And we'd be living in a different world today. We wouldn't have become the United States of America, at least back then. We would have remained a British colony. And think of how life would be so different. Sometimes, kind of like what Washington and his men went through, God calls us to go through similar circumstances, if you will, and wrestle with some of the same things. He calls us to wait. He calls us to persevere in the face of amazing obstacles and overwhelming odds. And that brings us to the big idea for this morning. If you believe that God is great, you know his work is worth the wait. If you believe that God is great, deep down inside, you know his work is worth the wait. Today we're going to look at the example of Abraham and Sarah and how they demonstrated faith in God in the face of what was seemingly overwhelming odds. We will see that they, like us, were far from perfect and made mistakes. In fact, their faith was messy at times, but God blessed their faith nonetheless. So our story takes us back where we began last week, back in Genesis 12, when Abraham was 75 years old. God promised him that he would make Abraham into a great nation. In other words, he would have so many descendants that they would form a great people. God also promised Abraham that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan. We often refer to it as the promised land because it is the land that God promised them. Then sometime later in Genesis 13, we don't know how much time elapsed, God reinforced and restated these promises to Abraham. And then you fast forward to Genesis 15, again, we don't know how much time has elapsed. God once again restates these promises to Abraham once again. And he reiterates and says, these are true, you can trust me. And so at this point, we don't know exactly how old Abraham was, but we know he was more than 75 years old. I think that's important to keep in mind. So to him, if he's going to have a child, the time is ticking. I've known folks half his age worried that their time was ticking today about having children. You can imagine how he was feeling at this time. And if you want to follow along with me in Genesis 15, we're going to be reading various scriptures through this section. Genesis 15, verses 1 through 6. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Notice, right here on this promise, Abraham had faith that God would honor his word, even though God's timing was way behind Abraham's. As Phil read from Hebrews 11 a minute ago, Abraham's faith that God could miraculously give him and Sarah a child, even though he was past age and as good as dead. I mean, that's what that's what Hebrews said, trying to emphasize it. And Sarah herself was barren. He had faith in spite of these things. In spite of what it looked like, he trusted God. Perhaps you're like Abraham this morning, in that you're in a struggle with certain promises and certain truths that we read in his word today. Because as you look around, the landscape looks very confusing. Perhaps we need to exercise the same faith that Abraham did. Abraham believed God for his future son, but he seemed to wrestle a little bit with the other promise, the promise of the land. When you go back to that same chapter at verse 7, he also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abraham said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then jumping down to verse 17. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. Now, some of you are probably wondering, what in the world is going on with all this as you read it? It's important to understand the culture back then. Back in those days, when a covenant agreement was formed between two parties, animals would be cut in two, and the halves would be set opposite of each other. And then the two parties involved in the covenant would walk between those animal halves. What's that all about? What the action symbolized was that if either party failed on their end to honor their side of the covenant, if they failed, they would suffer the same fate as those animals. That's what that covenant meant. So here we have a covenant being formed between God and Abraham. God's presence, if you remember in the scriptures, is often represented by fire. When you think of how Moses was called, he was called through a what? A burning bush. And then when he led the Israelites at night through the wilderness, it was a pillar of fire. And so right here, we got God's presence manifested in this smoking fire pot with a blazing torch. And representing God's presence, it passes through these animal carcasses. Do you understand what God is saying right here? The God of the universe, the holy, righteous, omnipotent God is saying, if he does not honor his side of the covenant, he will become as these dead carcasses right here. So that leads us to the first point in our outline this morning. Sometimes God calls us to wait. Wait, W-A-I-T, that's our acronym for outline. The first point, the W, watch for God's work. Watch for God's work. God's action here for Abraham showed how serious he was about keeping his promise. Showing how serious he was about, you can trust me. He was saying, I am not someone who goes back on my word. And I'm willing to do this much to show you. But here's the thing. Today, God has given us an even greater assurance than he did Abraham back then. For we know the Bible tells us, for all have fallen short of the glory of God and have sinned. And the wages of sin is death. We have not honored our part of the covenant with God. But God, even though we were the ones who deserved it, is the one who passed through the carcasses literally. When he died on the cross and his flesh was mutilated. And to show us just how true his word was, even after doing that, taking the penalty of the covenant for us, he rose from the grave as he said he did, as he said he would. That's how we know his death was not in vain. If we would but look to the cross and the empty grave, we would see evidence of God's amazing grace and love. And also God's amazing power to keep and honor his promises. When God calls us to wait, it is important that we look for his work then on the cross, as well as his work around us today, to assure us that he will get us where we need to be when we need to be there. But waiting on God is hard, isn't it? Especially when things seem to be getting nowhere. Nothing's changing. Nothing's getting better. Nothing's working out. It is during these seasons that we are tempted to take matters into our own hands and do things our way rather than trusting God to get us there. And that brings us to the second point. We need to avoid trying to force God's hand. Avoid trying to force God's hand. By the time we get to Genesis chapter 16, another decade had passed. Since God had first promised Abraham his descendants, and there was still no sign of Sarah having a baby. So Abraham would have been in his mid-80s by this time, and Sarah would have been in her mid-70s. Logic told Sarah that they had missed the window for childbearing. Sarah had reached the point that she was ready to give up on God and take matters into her own hands. So when you turn to Genesis 16, we read this beginning at verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. Now, again, back in the culture in that day, if a wife was barren, she could present one of her maidservants to her husband to serve as a surrogate wife. And that's exactly what Sarah did with Hagar. Sarah evidently felt that she needed to give God a little push, give him a little help, because obviously it wasn't working the way things were going. So she wanted to give God a little nudge to help him out. When you stop and think about it, Sarah seems to have control issues like a lot of us. But anytime we get ahead of God or we try to force things because he's not working in our schedule, according to our schedule, we wind up making a mess of things. Going back to verse 4, when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Think of all the heartache and hurt that resulted from that one decision. Abraham wound up having to deal with jealousy and bitterness from his wife. Their marriage had friction because of it. Hagar wound up being despised and mistreated by Sarah for just doing what Sarah said. Imagine how that abuse affected Hagar, and that friction between their relationship affected her son Ishmael later on as he was growing up. Years later, when Sarah did have her son Isaac, imagine how that made Ishmael feel. Ishmael was mocking little Isaac a lot, like a lot of other older half-brothers would do when he was having a celebration after he was weaned from his mom. Well, guess what? Sarah got mad at this, at that other woman's child for mocking him. I don't think Sarah ever uses Hagar's name. It's that other woman, that maidservant. So she told Abraham, you need to get rid of Hagar and him. That boy has no share in your inheritance. What did that do to Hagar and Ishmael? What did that do to Abraham's heart? Ishmael is his son. And so he gives them a little food and sends them on their way, and before long, they're wandering in the desert of Beersheba, just the two of them. Hagar eventually ran out of water and found herself sobbing and fearing that Ishmael would die, but God fortunately came to their aid. But the important thing about this story, as you see through countless stories in the Bible, and honestly, if you look around us at the countless stories of those around us, and sometimes even in our own life, we make a mess of things when we try to force God's hand rather than waiting and trusting in Him. How many people have taken out loans or ran up a credit card debt to acquire things that they had to have right in that moment, rather than waiting until they had enough money, and now they're in a world of debt that's just weighing down on them? How many people have been angry in the moment, and rather than pausing to pray as they know they should and allow God to help them sort through their thoughts and feelings, they ignore that little voice that says, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it. And then they lash out with destructive words that cannot be taken back. And they even wind up adding more pain for themselves and those around them. How many people have ever maybe been frustrated at work to the point where things didn't seem to be moving fast enough, where they wanted another job, and so they just quit cold turkey without waiting on God, without making sure there was another opportunity, and they just quit and walk out, and if they have a family, the family suffers for a while because work doesn't come right up again very quickly. There's numerous examples we could use. I remember a guy years ago, I was talking to him, and he was calling me because he was getting ready to connect with an old flame from high school on Facebook. And I don't know if he was seeking my permission or what. He was married. And I just remember getting to the point in the conversation where he was going to go through with it. I said, do you realize you're going to do this, and it's like you're slapping God in the face, and then you're just going to ask Him for forgiveness? He said, yes. He couldn't see me over the phone, but I was like, whoa. Have we ever done that? Oh, He'll just forgive me. I'm going to force His hand. Jesus died. He died just for these things. I'm just going to sin and not worry about it because He'll just forgive me. It's a little presumptuous. Grace is free, but it is not cheap. It cost Him dearly for us just to try and force His hand time and time again. If you believe that God is great, you know that His work in that marriage, in that particular case, give his marriage time to heal and work with Him. If you believe God is great, then you will do that because you know his work is worth the wait. Easier said than done, right? In Genesis 17, God reaffirms his covenant with Abraham once again. And then we see Abraham's reaction in verses 17 through 18. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Does it sound like he's ready to go have a son right now? He's 99 years old, soon to be 100, and he laughs at the thought of him having a child at this point in their life. By world standards, they are past their childbearing years, big time. It has been 13 years since the birth of Ishmael. Probably roughly 22, 23, maybe 24 years since the promise was first made. Almost a quarter of a century. And Abraham, he ain't what he used to be. You know what I'm talking about? Neither is Sarah at this point. Physically, it seems impossible. You can almost hear some of the thought process running through Abraham's mind as he's saying, oh, now that we're past our younger days, we're going to get a child. God, your timing seems to be a day late and a dollar short. We're getting too old for this sort of thing, let alone raising a child at our age. But God assures Abraham of his promise. And sometime later, we don't know how long, in the next chapter, in chapter 18, we read this in verse 10 through 15. Then the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, would I really have a child now that I am old? And hear this next line. Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, I did not laugh. But he said, yes, you did laugh. The third point this morning, increase your view of God. Increase your view of God. God asked that rhetorical question of Abraham, is anything too hard for the Lord? Some of us are going through a season in our life right now. And we're wondering and we're watching and everything around us, and everything seems to be going against us. And we don't see how God could ever do anything with this mess in our life. And we need to hear the Holy Spirit whispering in our ear, is anything too hard for God? And the obvious answer is what? No. In Genesis 19, Abraham witnessed God at work as he judged Sodom and Gomorrah. He witnessed and watched the power of God's work as the dense smoke was rising up from those two cities after God had rained down burning sulfur upon them. Then in Genesis 20, Abraham prayed and saw how God restored fertility to King Abimelech's wife and slave girls so they could bear children once again. In both cases, Abraham watched and witnessed the amazing power of God at work around him. He had his eyes open. These examples reinforce point number one where we started out with. Watch for God's work. The need to watch for God's work while we're waiting. You see, our faith falters when we lose sight of how big God is. He doesn't operate according to our thoughts. He doesn't operate according to our schedules. He does not operate according to our abilities. He does not need our help. He's huge. As Barney said on Andy Griffith's show, he's big, real big, big, big. When the Israelites were pinned against the Red Sea, you remember that scene? The Egyptian army was breathing down their necks. Did they respond with faith initially? No, they turned to Moses. Why did you lead us out here? We told you to leave us alone when we were slaves in Egypt. And what happened? God increased their view of him as he parted the sea before them, allowing them to cross safely while he protected them from their back. And then when the Egyptians came in after them, after they had crossed, the waters collapsed over the Egyptian army and drowned them all. They needed to increase their view of God. The disciples who followed Jesus, Jesus talked about dying and rising from the grave all the time. But it didn't seem to register for one reason or another. So when Jesus was arrested, what happened? They all abandoned him in fear because they didn't understand the plan and what was going on around them. They denied him. Judas betrayed him. And then they watched him die on the cross. And then we read later that they're hiding up in a house. And when the women come to tell him, hey, he's risen, they're like, yeah, right. It wasn't until they saw him. It wasn't until Thomas put his hands in his wounds that he believed. At the resurrection, Jesus showed them and us that our view of God needs to increase. As Paul said in the scriptures, God is capable of doing more than we could ever imagine or fathom. In Genesis 21, Abraham and Sarah have their son and name him Isaac. And then we read Sarah's reaction in verses 6 through 7. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone here who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. This is the fourth and final point. Treasure God and his blessings. Treasure God and his blessings. Sarah's laughing again, but unlike the previous time when she was laughing in unbelief and kind of sarcasm, this time she's laughing with joy at the amazing, miraculous power of God. Nobody will believe it. He's so powerful. When God comes through for us, we should celebrate, especially after a period of waiting. We should take time to pause and acknowledge his goodness, his grace, and his greatness. So if you're struggling today, if you're searching for answers in life, let me encourage you to look at Abraham and Sarah's example. If you go back and read the specifics, there's a whole lot of mistakes they made that I didn't have time to cover this morning. But God still was patient with them and worked with them. Let me encourage you to look at their example and put your faith in God, no matter how things look right now. He invites you into a covenantal relationship through his son, Jesus Christ. Jesus died so that you might live. So take him up on his offer. Recognize him as your Savior and Lord, and he will bless you. He assures us one time he's going to come back. At some point he'll return and make everything right and new. We will experience that eternal life and salvation on a level that we can never begin to imagine. But until then, we're called to wait until he completes his kingdom. But if you believe that God is great, you know his work is worth the wait. Let us stand and sing.
Our closing hymn is in the hymn book on page 400.